Okay, so this week we talk about internal control, chapter 7. And that I want to run through with you is the evolution of internal control. So as we were looking at internal control prior to the 1990s, internal control was thought of as kind of like a police, looking for fraud, looking for misappropriate of assets. And what it has become is more of a as globalization, organizations get larger and larger, what internal control has basically become is the goal of providing some sort of reasonable assurance. So we're not there necessarily to be there to catch fraud. I mean, obviously we are, but what we're basically saying is we're not going to catch everything. And the goal is to put together objectives and a program to verify and help managers maintain control over their operations and their functions. So that's kind of what the whole goal of internal control is, and also with regards to compliance is to stay. So when we look at those three objectives, which are reporting, operations, and compliance for internal control, what we do is we start out as a high-level objective. So for each area of reporting, for example, there will be one big top-level objective within the internal control, and then we'll drill down from there and have objectives with regards to things like accounts receivable. And so we'll go down from there, and then you can see the different things we could do, subjectives within these, regarding records and everything else. So within the objectives of reporting, operations, and compliance, the idea again is to have a system in place of internal control that helps the end user and that the financial statements are reliable. So ultimately, the goal of internal control is to have the financial information prepared in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles. And you cannot do it perfectly. You're going to have some fraud that slips through at your company at some point. Somebody is going to steal from the till. But what you can do is provide a reasonable assurance that the information in the accounting financial statements is in accordance with GAAP. So I think I talk a lot about confidence level. The idea is to get a high confidence level that this information is correct. We're not looking for perfection, but we're looking for a very high confidence level that's in accordance with GAAP. Now, I want to talk about the Foreign Corrupt Policies Act, or Practices Act, because that has caught a few companies in the crosshairs recently, companies that you would recognize. For example, Avon. I know we all know about that makeup company, right? So what's happened is, with the globalization of the economy, a lot of companies went to go do business overseas. And the act says that not only are you not allowed to make an illegal payment or bribes to foreign officials, but also you have to have a system of internal control in place. Now, what I want to say about this is it's easier said than done, because what happens is the way we do business in the United States is not always the same way that foreign companies, their political systems and their methods of doing businesses are different. So sometimes to be competitive overseas, you have to go along to get along. Now, I'm not saying that that's the right thing to do, and obviously a lot of companies have gotten into trouble for this. So maybe originally that's what they thought they were doing, and it is illegal. So I'm sharing this information with you just to give you a different perspective on that. But the idea, and again, when this all came down, of course, top management said, "Oh, I didn't know this was going on. I didn't know I was making foreign bribes to foreign officials," and a lot of it was just to get the job done. But it doesn't matter; it's still wrong, and it can now. Not only will it result in fines, but imprisonment of manager. So you can't. You cannot say that you didn't know. You have to have a system of internal control in effect to avoid these types of things like bribes and illegal payments. You can't get away with saying, "I didn't know any better" anymore. All right, so let's look at the components of internal control. Okay, so there's a lot of discussion of the control environment, the risk assessment that goes along with it, control activities, information systems relevant to financial reporting and communication, monitoring activities. Now, I'll just give you a little warning. If you're studying for the CPA, and I really hope that you are if you're taking this class, because a great time to start looking at it seriously, maybe even taking a review, is right after this class. This is the proper time to be taking the CPA. But all discussion aside, the components of internal control, this is a study index card that will be probably back to you on that CPA exam. I've seen this list before. This is nothing unique to this book. This is exactly what the components of an internal control are, and you should try to memorize this list or give it an acronym or whatever. Information systems control. I think that when I was doing my review class, they used the acronym, and this is terrible, but CRIME, which is control environment. I'm sorry, control activities, risk assessment. All right, information systems, right? Monitoring activities, and control environment. So I know this will come back because it was on my index cards to study. So make sure you know everything there is. A great question would be, all of the following are except, and then one you've missed off the list. So remember CRIME. That's a terrible way to remember, but control activities, risk, information monitoring, and environment. Okay, so let's go to the control environment factors. So the control environment, within the control environment, you have to have a commitment to integrity of ethical values. That goes down to that tone at the top, which means the board of directors must demonstrate independence, and there should be effective structure in place, including lines of reporting. This is why you go into a company and there's that org chart. You're like, well, who goes to who? It has to be nice and tight. And then, of course, a commitment to attract, develop, and retain competent employees, the human resources end of that. That basically goes into the control environment. And then, of course, some sort of way to hold employees accountable. And a lot of this is tone at the top. And, I always say, if you've got an employee, and this is just a sidebar, that does not take responsibility for their acts, you should really watch that. Everybody should be prepared to have a professional work environment, emotionally intelligent, with responsibility for the acts. Okay, so let's talk about the R, risk assessment. Okay, so the risk assessment, we talked about this in 5 and 6, and we want to make sure that we have objectives to identify and assess the risks. And then, of course, we need to, as we're going through these objectives, go in and look for ways things can go wrong. And in the book, they talk a little bit about risk tolerance. And I want to talk a little bit about it in the sense that it's kind of a confidence level. It's a level where we only accept this much, and then somewhere in place, either in your IT or in your monitoring, there's a trigger that something's off. An outlier has been identified. And in the book, they talk about, for example, a company may expect the staff to respond to all customer complaints within 24 hours, but accept that 10% of the complaints receive a response within 36 hours. It's something that you can go into your IT department and go in and look at the responses and run an assessment. Is anyone watching this? Who's watching the pod? Basically, do you have these things in place? Could you maybe identify that? Control activities. Okay, so the control activities, I used that for the C in CRIME. That would be performance reviews. No one wants to have their employee evaluation unless they think they're getting a raise. But performance reviews are important, and if sometimes it's just and the goals of performance reviews is not to pick out who's doing right or wrong, but to make sure that you're aligned with the organizational's ultimate objectives and goals. Transaction control activities. Are there frequent audits? Physical controls. Do people lock their doors? Do people put their password up on the computer for everyone to see? Hopefully not. I remember when I first started working at the bank, there were 3 people working there who had on a sticky note all their passwords to get into the computer, like on their screens, sticky noted and taped to the screen, so you couldn't just rip it off real quick if somebody walked in your office. No, permanently affixed. That would be an example of physical controls. And the other thing that they talk about is the custody of assets within a segregation of duties. So who is doing what? You cannot, I know it's very expensive to hire staff, and it's very expensive to get this right, but you cannot have the same people doing every single thing. You have to have different people doing different stuff, because if you have one person doing everything, then they have the potential to rip you off. Now here's the little diagram on custody of assets, and you can just sit there and make a graph out who's doing what. So whoever has custody should not be keeping the records. So for example, if somebody is writing the checks out each month, someone else should be reconciling them. If somebody is making the bank deposits, then somebody else should be reconciling the deposits at the end of the month. If somebody has a key to the inventory locker, then someone else should count it at the end of the year and maintain the inventory schedules. It goes on and on, but duties must be separate. Okay, so the objectives of an accounting system are to identify and record valid transactions, and an accounting information system in particular is very helpful in all these areas. And putting together a proper accounting information system and setting it up with your IT and your group. As a small business owner, you can go in and set it up in the cloud. There's so many options. I could go in and spend a class on this. I think I actually do. But ultimately, that is your goal. Within monitoring, okay, that's our M in crime. And I might have hopped ahead talking about accounting information system because I do love AIS. Within monitoring, the goal of monitoring is to assess the quality of your quality control. Are you getting it right? So as much as you do your quality control, you need somebody to walk over and look and see what could be triggering failures and breakdowns in your internal control. Here's a great example. If you have constant turnover of employees, if you have constant customer complaints, look for triggers. If you have employees that are in a situation where they are living way beyond their means. If you have an administrative assistant that drives up in a Lamborghini, you might want to question some things. So limitations on internal control. Remember, I talked about confidence level. Things are going to go wrong within your internal control and things may slip through the cracks. It costs too much to monitor every single transaction if we can afford to do it. And it's funny that we're having this conversation because one of the discussion board questions out there is about the possibility of data analytics and how during an audit you might be able to grab every single transaction. So at some point there may not be as big of a limit on what you can do, but whenever you have a human being involved, things may go wrong. So looking at this, controls that depend on segregated duties, okay, can be circumvented. I've had this happen to me. I worked in a bank, and I tell my bank stories because that's what I know. I worked at a branch that I was a line manager at the time. I was a line manager for the teller line, and I got a call from my supervisor to go to another bank branch right away and run the line during the 5 o'clock Friday afternoon check cashing traffic. And we had a busy teller line. We were one of the busiest branches before, as you get promoted up and all. We happened to have a very busy branch ourselves. I was really surprised of what was going on. I went over to the branch and I walked by the boardroom. The branch manager, the teller line manager, and 3 employees were sitting there with the FBI. And the FBI, who carries guns and wears those protective gears from being shot at, bulletproof vests and stuff like that. And me, as a young, newly entering the workforce, recent college graduate, was a little bit terrified and a little bit surprised. And of course, I ran into a branch I'd never been into, ran the 5 o'clock Friday afternoon check cashing line and did fine. What I found out was that the manager and the assistant manager were in collusion to kite checks and had stolen over $100,000 from the bank. And the people in the boardroom were all going to jail. All of these people were people I knew personally, that I had been to company picnics with and knew from going out to lunch. And I look back at my life and wonder if I could have even been in that situation myself, where I'd have been asked to make uncomfortable decisions early on in my career. And so I look back with that and think that even if you do everything right, things can still go wrong and people can still break the law, and they do, and they collude, and you don't think that they're going to be that person, but sometimes they are. So you'd never be surprised what people who are in a financial situation would call upon themselves to do that is unethical. So there are limitations, and you can only get to a certain confidence level, and management can always override anything. So for that reason, you have a certain level of confidence, but you constantly need someone to monitor and look out for your internal. Okay, so enough on that. Let's look at the classifications of controls on financial reporting. And one of the things that we look at is different types. So we have preventative, which would be like a segregation of duties. And this again is another great question for a test. Which of these is a preventative procedure? Detective, which is to discover things that after they've occurred, like reconciling the monthly bank statement. Corrective, to remedy something. So for example, if you make a mistake, go in and fix it. And sometimes these things overlap. All right, so these are our classifications. Let's talk about enterprise risk management. So enterprise risk management basically comes in, and the goal of it is to align the operations with strategy. And as I do more reading, particularly as I teach at the MBA level, there is so much of a need for management to align with their ultimate strategy. So managers come out, they have a strategy written down, they've got goals, it's all high level, and then the goal is to get that framework down to the front lines. And so constantly reassessing their alignment with strategy. So, and they also come in, the goal of ERM is to break it down into these, or actually ERM framework, by my time, is 5 components. One of them is the culture and governance, and the idea is to set the tone at the top. And there's been so much change at tone at the top, and I'm excited for the fact that that is something that managers are doing. The other thing is setting business and strategy objectives, probably along the lines of a balanced scorecard, which is something that you can look at in some of your other accounting classes. Performance and assessing what worked and what didn't, and putting that risk in a kind of a portfolio view based on the risk of the organization. Review and revision, constantly going back and updating things, and then communicating and information. So the auditor's overall approach to the audit, and I see these things and they don't seem like they're that important. Maybe they are, maybe they don't feel very important to you right now, but you really need to memorize these things. You're going to take CPA. I guess this is the CPA chapter, because I see all this and all I see is things that are just so important. So your steps to the audit. First, there is the planning. And then step 2 is obtaining an understanding of the client and its environment. Remember, every environment is different, and they have to do it, including internal control, assessing the risks of material misstatement. Some of these are old hat. Performing further procedures, substantive procedures, and then completing and then issuing the audit report. Okay, so 2 through 4, these right here are about the internal control right here. These are the ones that are about the internal. So let's look at obtaining an overall understanding of the client. So one of the things that you would do for identifying potential material misstatements and considering these factors, so looking for things that might be risk factors to material possible misstatements. A little bit of this comes out of chapter 6 and the different types of audit evidence, and then designing the test of controls and substantive procedures. Okay, so that is how the understanding of internal control will help the auditors in conducting the audits. And then there's 5 internal control components. Remember when I said crime? Here they are again. I'm trying to write this down again for you. Crime, C, well, this is the E part. Environment is the E, okay? They have them all out of order here. C, and then risk, and then I, E, and then M. And then if you rearrange it in an acronym, CRIME. So you definitely need to know these 5 internal control components. Okay, hit next one. Okay, so when you obtain the understanding, what do you do to do that? So you acquire of personnel, go out on the front lines, look at the documents, trace the transaction. It's called a system walkthrough. So you walk out, you're sitting there out on the line, you go outside and you start with, you start with a receipt and you walk it all the way to the financial statement, where you go to the financial statement and you walk it all the way back to the receipt. And then maybe even to the inventory piece if you purchased it. Go through all the paperwork and walk it back and forth. Test a few things. Walk up and talk to the people. Do they have a comment like, well, this is how we really do it? Or do they seem to be happy with their management team? These are the things that It's like being, I think I said this before, it's like being an investigative reporter. Also, just understanding the business in general. The way a winery works is a lot different than the way a normal manufacturing plant would work that was making salt or sugar. The way some of the things I'm just thinking in Portland, the way Boeing manufacturers may be different than a different one. There's all different ways. Nike versus Adidas. Everybody has their own ways of doing things. So you have to understand how they do their business. Okay, next. All right, so documenting the internal control. All right, so there's a couple of ways you could do it. One of the ones that's very helpful is the flow chart. So you can understand how everything kind of walks through the system. And you learn a little bit about that in accounting information systems, and you can tighten that up, but just understanding how the control or kind of the segregation of duties and how things move through is very cool. Okay, and here is an example of this flow chart, and you can see right here, once you start walking through this, it gets pretty impressive. So we start here in the mailroom, and you can see these little slashy things are like the documents, and then the ones that look like a kind of like an upside down, is this a trapezoid? I hope this is the right word, are things that people do. So these slashy things are documents, and these are things that people do. And then these are registers. The boxes are registers, and then here's an outside entity, a bank. So you can see here how everything kind of walks through the process of going through the flow chart. So kind of helpful, very helpful. You can see the different things. Also, you can see where the physical custody goes from mailroom to cashier to AR, and so on and so forth. Okay, so assessing the risk of material misstatement. The general approach is to identify the risks while obtaining an understanding of the client and their environment. So the main thing is as you're coming through, trying to understand what's going on, you can use a questionnaire to do that. And they've got a really cool one. I don't know if you're able to see it on figure 723 in your book that just kind of walks through an example of the cash receipts sales cycle. They talk about looking at the nature of transactions. The ones that we're most concerned with are non-routine and estimation transaction. If it's non-routine, should be like a little bit of a looking at it a little closer. The ones that the auditors are going to be very, very concerned about are estimations, because those are the ones that are done very rarely and also involve judgment by management. And of course, generally routine has the strongest control. So here's some assessing risks. And here are some examples at the financial statement level. Preparing period-end financial statements, including the development of significant accounting estimates, the IT general controls, the control environment, and then how you would assess to a high risk. The more risk you see, the more you're going to look at it a little closer. I mean, you'd be surprised, even just little words. People are so transparent. So the more you see it, for example, I'm just trying to think of an example. Right off the top of my head, I had a situation where someone was like, when they said, and I happen to be responsible for maintaining the keys to the lockbox when I first started working at the bank. And later on, when I became a compliance officer, one of the things that came up was I had someone who said, I really don't like to use that system to maintain the keys to the lockbox. We had a lockbox, and there were several different sets of keys. The box was super old, like back from the 1800s. Probably should have updated it, but that's a whole other story. And I worked at a very large traditional branch. And that very statement just coming out of the mouth of that one employee got me to wanting to dig a little deeper. And when I found those keys, it was such a huge mess that I ended up pulling out 3 weeks of my time to reorder everything. There were duplicates of keys. Nothing was secure. It was kind of a mess. And so sometimes when somebody makes just an off-the-cuff statement, you can find so much behind it, just at a personal level. Okay, so let's take a look at this assertion level. Here's an example of a risk. Failure to recognize impairment losses on long-lived assets affects only the valuation assertion. Inaccurate counting of inventory affects valuation of inventory and cost of goods sold. So looking at those assertions and using those assertions to inform your test of controls and substantive procedures. Remember, substantiating your assertions by testing usually third parties, if you can get that, or recognition, right? And then here you continue, as you find more things, you continue to dig. You continue to look and see how things come out, perform further procedures. All right, now here's another one for the CPA exam. I'm going to do a big old circle because I see all these things coming up and I'm like, oh yeah, I know that. All right, so tests of controls include inquiries, inspections, observations, and re-performance of the controls. That's an example. So, and the way it would be worded on the test is all of the following include tests and controls except, and then you need to know which one is not a test of control. So the best way to do is get your note card out and start looking at these for memorization. All right. The results are used to determine, so once you figure out what's going on with the internal controls, then you decide how deep you're going to dig and substantiate procedures. If you feel like everything's going great, then you'll probably stop and move on from an area. If you have a concern or something's off the cuff or there's a little problem, kind of like pulling a loose thread. Like one loose thread, you want to see if it'll unravel, you know? We talked about data analytics, and I'll say it again. You can probably go in and test an entire population instead of a sample. And one of the cool things about this is the bigger population, the more confidence you have in your tests. If you test 10, you probably may have missed something. If you test 1,000, then you've got a better chance of getting it right. All right, so we look at this diagram. It came up a little small on my slide for internal control, but I encourage you to go look on page or figure 7-7. And I'm pulling it up right now so I can see if there's anything that is pressing. And I would go in and take a look at this personally. I would suggest looking at. Okay, so we talk about the work of an internal auditor, and one of the areas that gets very confusing is what we can use from the internal auditor and what we need to verify. So you can go out and have the internal auditor gather all the items for you. And I've been on the internal audit side before, and I've had to go and get stacks and stacks of stuff for people that are trying to do an audit. You can use it. You can obtain the auditor's evidence. You can use them to provide, assistance in the external auditor. However, what you can't do, and they talk about it a little bit, but you can't substitute the internal auditor's work papers for your own. So, for example, if the internal auditor gives you receipts, it has copies of receipts that they have made. They go and you're like, okay, you asked for the receipts, and they go out and make a bunch of copies for you of receipts. And then they have the receipts in the main file. No, I want to see those originals, okay? If the internal auditor keeps a journal of all of the inventory. For example, you have an inventory journal, and I'm just thinking maybe large ticket item. And you're auditing, let's say you're auditing a car dealership, and you want a journal of all the Priuses or whatever, if you're doing like a floor plan audit, okay? And the internal auditor says, okay, here is my list of all the cars. No, you have to, as an auditor, go out and verify all that is there. You can't take the word. So yes, the internal auditor can gather the bank statement, gather the receipts originals, all, okay? Gather anything that you want to look at. Gather the unsigned checks, gather whatever. They can hand you their inventory report. Does that mean that you don't have to go out and count the cars? You got to go out and count the cars. Or at the very least, you've got to walk the lot. Now, if you're a small company and the inventory is thousands and thousands of items, then you hire an outside company and you get that audit report from them. But that's how you use an internal auditor if you're a public company or a public accounting auditor. All right, I've talked a lot about that, but I just wanted to share that a little bit. We're on service organizations. Software as a service is a great example. They talk about outsourcing payroll and internet. This is a tricky one. You have to, again, obtain and visit. And there's two types for service auditors. There's the service auditor that provides an examination of the services control, and then the user auditor that uses that report. Okay, I'm going to hop through service organizations, and I'm going to talk about the deficiencies in internal control. If there is a material weakness. Okay, here. That is the highest level of deficiency in internal control. That means that it's going to make, it's a weakness that's so weak that it could make a material effect on the financial report. All right, now let's talk about management's report of internal control. Management must acknowledge that they are responsible for internal control, and they have to assess the effectiveness of the internal control on the last year of the fiscal year, and they also have to support the evaluation with audit evidence. And this is very important. I'm going to hop through internal control in a small company because you can look at that yourself. And this is pretty much what I've got for today. Final thoughts on internal control. Very important part of the audit environment is your internal control. Internal control basically sets the course for how much work you're going to do, how many procedures you're going to have to perform, whether or not you're going to have to really dig deep. So that starts the assessment of internal controls first, once you obtain an understanding. And then once you figure out where you're at in internal control, then it's off to the races with what you're going to test. So look at internal control as kind of the gateway to how fast this horse is going to run. Is it going to, are we going to get through this quickly, or are we going to be digging and digging and digging a lot? And a lot of times, another thing that, and I don't know if I read this in your chapter or I overlooked it, but just because the internal control is not in effect does not necessarily mean that there's fraud and misappropriation of assets. There are a lot of honest people, sole proprietors with great administrators who simply do not have controls in place and don't operate with internal control. Does that mean they're all stealing? No. It just means that you, to obtain a reasonable assurance, are going to have to do more work as an auditor. And I'll leave you with that, and I appreciate you listening to my lecture. Have a great rest of your week, and talk to you soon. Thank you.